meeting. But again, my name is Wright. I'm a native aquatic species coordinator. I was supposed to be joined by our wetlands program coordinator, Brian Sullivan, but he's sick this week. So it's just me or Stephanie. But I was very fortunate to be part of a team. Myself, Brian Sullivan, and Mark Vieira, our carnivore and fur program manager, in helping develop Colorado's beaver conservation management strategy, which I'm here to talk about today. And I'm sorry, I forgot the talk is supposed to be called Chew on This, so chew on this. But beavers have been out there sculpting our valley bottoms and waterways since time immemorial, creating vast wetlands that are dynamic and back up sediment and provide important habitat for wildlife. In some of our more arid landscapes, like Beaver Road Creek on the Moon Plateau, they're really essential to keeping water on the landscape for fish and amphibians and all kinds of wildlife. And also in some of our eastern plains streams, like West Plum Creek, shown here. And we typically think beavers are everywhere, all over Colorado, plains, the desert systems, mountains, but we typically associate them in these more picturesque mountain settings, which indeed that is where some of their habitats are most prevalent and where there's a big movement to try to restore them currently. To some of these picturesque locations, like here in the headwaters of the Roaring Fork. And there's been a lot of research lately that I'm sure people have heard about sort of the increased resilience to wildfire that beaver habitat and wetlands provide. I think sometimes it gets overstated to some degree, but for sure, this is the only green patch left behind after a fire burned through this watershed, right? And so they certainly help maintain those green strips of wetland vegetation. And what maybe is understated is just the value they provide post-fire when there's a lot of debris and sediment runoff that can negatively affect downstream water supplies. But of course, as we've heard about through some of our other speaker series, we're kind of lucky that beavers are even still here today. The massive, well, really the desire for fashionable hats in Europe really drove the fur trade market here in North America. And that swept into the West around 1805 when mountain men started showing up and trapping beavers. That era ended around 1840, but nearly wiped out our beavers. But in the early 1900s, there was this movement afoot to try to restore beavers back on the landscape. If you looked at our beaver strategy, I will just tease a little bit by saying there's this really awesome preface, an article about this guy, Charles W. Harris, who was the commissioner of the Colorado Game and Fish Commission in 1902. And he had some pretty outlandish ideas about how to solve Colorado's waterways. He said, he was quoted as saying, years ago there were millions of beaver in the mountains of Colorado, and yet no one ever complained of a shortage of water then, but the value of their pelts doomed them to destruction. He went on to say, many of the mountain valleys, which were once a succession of grassy meadows made by the beavers, are now dry gorges, and the fertile soil, which back in behind the dam, has all been washed away again. And then he went on to say, now if the government will spend about $1 million a year in the propagation and distribution of beavers, there will be plenty of water in every stream that comes down from the mountains. There's a lot of other great newspaper clippings that I came across in my research working on the beaver strategy. I'm choosing a few to cover here. Here's one from the Holy Cross Trail on March 26th of 1932. An article called Be Reminded, letter to the editor. It says, the Palisade Rod and Gun Club adopted a wise resolution when it declared in favor of protection of beaver and transferring them when they become troublesome that the heads of streams where the dams are used for conservation. When I went away, for a head of water, I simply start a dam with a few logs and sticks, and the beaver does the rest. Or this one, I really like this one. This was an article just simply titled "Colorado has 48,000 beaver," in which a very competent director of the State Game and Fish Commission (CNP) said, "This is not an estimate, but an actual count. We had it true all summer, and we know how many we have. We know how many to help, how many to transport, and how many to leave. Colorado is one of the leading states in the field of beaver production and management." But he was probably right about that at the time. Shortly after World War II, in the 1940s and 1950s, the Colorado Game and Fish Commission, which of course now is Colorado Parks and Wildlife, actually employed a team of beaver trappers whose job it was to count, to trap, and move beavers. And they were pretty prolific during that time. So these are just some pictures I pulled out of the 1952 reports. Talking about all the work that was going on with beavers. And I found this remarkable. In 1951 alone, this team of trappers employed by the state moved 1,253 beavers. They trapped and transplanted 1,253 beavers. This is a distribution of their weight in pounds. How many people know about the Idaho parachuting beaver story? All right, cool. Well, if you didn't know about it, you should. Look it up on YouTube. There's some great videos. But Idaho Game and Fish really embraced this story. There's a lot of marketing around it, like the sticker they put on this slide. They actually, using a bunch of surplus parachuting materials from the war in Idaho, released some that's just under 100 beavers by parachute. And these crates that were attached to parachute, dropped them out of the airplane. The crates were designed so that upon impact they opened. And this was a kind of, I don't know, it was a viral story like 5 years ago or something. I heard it. But I was just tickled when I learned that, well, Colorado did the same thing. In 1952, we had an experimental beaver released by airplane. And here's pictures from that. A Cessna fixed wing tail dragging airplane, one of those beaver crates out of the upon impact. We only moved 12 beavers to 4 locations, according to the sources I found. But one of our district wildlife managers on the western slope was telling me we actually did much more than that, and that there's some video evidence probably out there if you talk to the right people. So that's the next one. And interestingly, after that time period in the 1950s, there kind of was a waning effort on beaver restoration. I don't know if it's because we reached a point where we felt like we restored beavers, or we moved on to other priorities. And that's not to say that CPW hasn't been doing beaver work for a long time. We do. Our district wildlife managers advise landowners on their human beaver conflicts, maybe sometimes assisting with moving of beavers. We fund a lot of wetlands restoration projects through our Wetlands to Wildlife program. We move beavers on some of our own properties, to and from some of our own properties. But in terms of a coordinated programmatic effort, there really hasn't been anything since these efforts in the 1950s. Now, Colorado is home to a really famous beaver advocate. Just another fun fact. Sherry Tippie, if you want to learn more about her, she's in this Beaver Believers film. There's a great post article about her, a PBS story. There's many more than that. But she moved over 1,000 beavers in the early 2000s with permits from our agency. But pretty well known, fun story. She's a hairdresser by day, and a beaver person by day as well. But I think the beaver is really cool. So I went to school for aquatic biology, and when I was an undergrad at CSU, all my professors were telling me that there's a paradigm shift in wildlife management from single species management to ecosystem management. Well, I've been in this career for 20 years, and I have to tell you, we're still managing by single species. And a lot of that's driven by the Endangered Species Act. I would say, as someone who's worked specifically in the conservation of non-game fish and amphibians, a lot of that's driven by the Endangered Species Act, which really cool about the beaver. By managing a single species, you manage an entire ecosystem. So I just think that's pretty cool. And, you know, all right. So thanks for humoring me on that long preamble, and I'm already cutting into Ryan's beer time. But That's not what I'm here to talk about. I just wanted to give a quick historical context and kind of set the stage for how, once again, Colorado is contemplating beaver conservation program. And that's what the beaver conservation and management strategy that I worked on with Brian and Mark is all about. And so for this actual presentation, there's going to be lots of slides with text. I wanted to do some fun picture slides at the beginning. I'm going to get to text. Sorry about that. But that's how you cover a 110-page document. So I'm going to kind of give an overview on the process that we use to develop the Beaver strategy. I'm going to introduce it more broadly and then talk about these 5 chapters, which are really the core pillars of beaver conservation, and then end with some next steps and final reflections. All right. So why did we develop a beaver management strategy and why now? Well, we know that beaver management touches diverse sectors in society, and different people relate with beavers in different ways. Some people love them, some people hate them. It depends on your perspective and what you know about them, I suppose. So it's a complicated topic. Any wildlife that has a human-wildlife conflict is complicated. We know that wetlands have been reduced across the West, estimated around 50% reduction, and wetlands created by beavers are a big part of that. But again, beavers are also a source of human-wildlife conflict, so if you're contemplating restoring them, you got to think about this human dimension. And there's just been this building movement, once again, similar to the early 1900s, of a lot of interested stakeholders that want to restore beavers. They want to restore the wetlands that beavers create, and they want the state to be more involved. And yet there's still this need to account for diverse perspectives and coordinate all these different partners so that science and data-driven management is at the forefront of the beaver movement. And interestingly, so there's this, the Beaver Institute, they host a biennial conference, BeaverCon. The second ever BeaverCon conference was in Boulder in 2024. Governor Jared Polis gave a speech at that meeting. I was there to see it. But I think just this really speaks to just the energy, political and advocacy energy behind the beaver movement. So to develop the beaver strategy, we first convened an internal working group, 26 different staff from across the agency, representing all the silos of our agency. And this helped us understand what our priorities and issues and concerns might be with regard to beaver management. But we also, through that process, realized that developing a management plan for beavers was going to be a huge risk. So we got a little extra funding to hire on some support. We hired Keystone Policy Center, Jackie Corday with Corday Natural Resources and Colorado Natural Heritage Program to help formulate a team to facilitate stakeholder engagement and then draft the beaver strategy. And so we'll talk more about that in a moment. And now we're in the third and final phase, which launched in March 2026, which is implementing the beaver strategy. We are committed to this restoration decision support tool, which you'll hear about more in the talk. That'll be coming soon, but excited to share good news about the new beaver program that CPW will have very soon. All right. So our stakeholder engagement process and public scoping process was really robust, but carried out over a pretty short time period. We had 12 different focus groups with 170 different participants, and we then took the most sort of vocal or most engaged from that process and had 2 process group meetings, where we got the people from these different 12 sector-based groups into one meeting to talk through some of the concepts we were considering for the beaver strategy. We had a technical advisory team that met 3 times with 38 participants from around the country. And then we had an online comment form during the scoping stage and had 300 respondents on that. We had our CPW working group, which I told you about. And then a lot of this is summarized in an appendix to the Beaver strategy, this scoping phase engagement synthesis report. And then I think what we took a lot of pride in was we heard a lot of inputs, ranging from strong opinions on both sides, beaver restoration, why don't we restore beavers? There's plenty of them. They're just come see my head, Dave, I'll show you, that sort of thing, to concern about, well, don't regulate the harvest of beavers, or on the other side, people saying you need to regulate the harvest of beavers more. And so we had all this input we were taking and kind of aligning that with our sort of value system that we approach beaver conservation and wildlife management in general when it comes to CPW, and trying to really kind of find middle of the road solutions. We take a lot of pride in how we incorporate stakeholder feedback, plus data-driven, scientifically driven wildlife management to come with our beaver strategy. For all that to say, we then released the draft strategy. We had 160 commenters on there. We went back and incorporated all the comments we received for that process. This is a list of the different focus groups: water users managers, conservation funders, beaver advocates, sports persons and beaver trapper hunters, agricultural landowners, watershed coalitions, local government, wildlife and conservation, nuisance operators and wildlife rehabilitators, tribal and indigenous interests, transportation infrastructure, and we had a mixed sector group for those who couldn't make one of these. And I'll just one more note on this. We didn't invite every beaver advocate and every water user. We kind of, it was all about leveling and finding the appropriate spokespeople for these groups that represent their interests. Okay, so that brings us to the beaver strategy itself. The purpose of our beaver conservation and management strategy is to increase and sustain the prevalence of beaver and beaver-influenced wetlands and suitable habitat for the benefit of Colorado's stream, wetland ecosystems, and an array of wildlife species that utilize it. And so the goal is to increase beaver populations and beaver-occupied wetland habitats in Colorado until social or ecological carrying capacity is reached. And we break the beaver strategy into these five chapters that each have their own overarching goal. And I'm not going to read all these now, but these are the five core pillars of beaver conservation management: population and habitat status monitoring, beaver harvest management, beaver restoration opportunities, living with beaver and non-lethal conflict resolution, and then translocation. This chapter was called Translocation Policy and Protocol. All right, so for each of these chapters, I'm just going to give just some brief context and then talk about, give the goal for that chapter and then the strategies to support that goal. But for our beaver strategy, our population goals are occupancy-based, not abundance-based. In other words, we're more interested to know where beavers are than we are to know how many beavers there are. And this makes sense if you're thinking about beaver conservation from the standpoint of wetland conservation. But we do need to have rough estimates of how many beavers there are to have harvest caps or to regulate the number of beavers that people harvest, hunters and trappers. And just some notes on the beaver population through time. I shared that article that said we had 48,000 beavers in 1941. There was another estimate in 1965 that estimated about 60,000. We did a present kind of more back of the napkin estimate for the beaver strategy of 43,000 to 64,000, and this is likely biased low because we use remote sensing data from the Colorado Beaver Activity Mapper to map all the active beaver areas, and then use literature-based assumptions about the number of beavers per colony to come up with that estimate. But only ponds, beaver dams, are revealed in that remote sensing. But we know there's a lot, like out here, this part of Colorado, most of the beavers don't build dams. They live in the banks of larger rivers. And so this didn't account for those. So it's likely an underestimate, and we acknowledge the need for more information. So the goal of this chapter is to improve knowledge of beaver wetland habitat and beaver populations in Colorado at multiple scales. And so for each of these chapters, we step them down into different strategies, which are further stepped down into actions. And I'm just going to highlight a few of the actions. I'll read the strategies to you so you know what they are, and then highlight a couple of, I think, maybe more relevant to this audience actions. So the first strategy to support this chapter goal is to estimate spatial extent of beaver wetlands and population size at statewide and watershed scales. And then the second strategy is to estimate beaver occupancy statewide and at the HUC 10 scale. So the Hydro Unit Code is a numerical system of identifying watersheds, and as the number of digits increases, that's a smaller watershed. So a 10-digit HUC is think of an example of a 10-digit HUC. Buckhorn Creek is probably a 10-digit HUC, for example, all the streams that feed Buckhorn. So we want to implement some pilot occupancy monitoring as priority HUCs, 2 to 3 of these HUC 10s. And then we want to create an iNaturalist community science project. So you can already in iNaturalist log beaver sightings, but we want to create a CPW specific projects where there's specific things we're looking for. All right, so moving on to the next chapter, chapter 4, harvest management, and I seem to be missing a slide. Yeah, we'll do it in this order. So the goal of this chapter is to manage beaver populations for continued sustainable avocational harvests. And the term avocational, that just means what you do when you're not working, what you do for your pastime. So avocational harvest is the harvest of beavers by licensed hunters and trappers. So this graph is showing estimated beaver harvests over a really long time period, 1957 to 2023. And you can see back in those days where we were more intensively managing beavers, harvesting up to 10,000 per year statewide. And an important thing to note on this is in 1996, Amendment 14 was passed by the voters. And Amendment 14 limits the tools that are available for beaver trapping to only live trapping devices and outlawed body ripping, foothold, counter bear traps, lethal traps. And this is significant. Colorado is just one of a few states that has limits on these techniques, whereas a lot of states still allow lethal trapping. It's kind of a natural limit on the amount of beaver harvest that can actually occur, and you see that reflected in these estimates after 1996. More recently, we've made our harvest survey more robust, so anyone who harvests a beaver has a voluntary survey they can take part in to report how many beavers they harvested. And we added in 2023 questions about whether they harvested their beaver on public or private land. So this graph is showing the estimated harvest with 95% confidence intervals because this was a survey, not the census. And you can see that we're right around 500 beavers harvested annually on public land. And current at statewide scale, currently that beaver harvest accounts for about 2 to 4% of our estimated population. The literature suggests up to 30% as being a sustainable amount of harvest. What we're proposing, what we have proposed to the commission, and we'll vote on later this year in July, is we heard a lot of concerns about the perception of our current beaver regulations, which allow unlimited harvest. And so sort of understanding those concerns, but also understanding the science of it, that the current harvest levels probably aren't affecting, at least at a statewide scale, beaver populations. We proposed harvest caps at the HUC 4 level, so there's that term HUC again. So these are the HUC 4 watersheds in Colorado. And so using those population estimates and a conservative sustainable harvest rate, set caps at these watersheds where if we exceed these, then we look at regulatory actions to limit beaver harvest at that watershed scale. And then the other thing we're recommending is a mandatory check on all beavers that are harvested so that we can get better spatial data, which we'll need for this type of analysis. One note here is one source of beaver mortality and beaver take that we don't have control over, that is under jurisdiction of the Colorado Department of Agriculture, is beavers that are taken from human-beaver wildlife conflict scenarios. And that's certainly a big source of beaver mortality that's unquantified, and we don't have a firm grasp on that. So again, the goal here is to manage beaver populations for continued sustainable avocational harvests. And there's 4 strategies to support this goal. The first is to develop sustainable harvest caps at major watershed scales. We just talked about that. We want to gain spatial resolution on harvest data. We also just talked about that. That's through mandatory checks that will give us that spatial information where the beaver was harvested so we can understand, while it may not be an issue at a statewide level, maybe it's an issue at smaller scales. And then evaluate harvest levels in beaver restoration opportunity watersheds, which you'll hear more about when I talk about Chapter 5. But these will be watersheds that we've identified as being really prime for beaver restoration activities. And then the fourth is to evaluate survival and sources of mortality in 2 to 3 pilot habitats. All right, so moving on to the 5th chapter, the one that probably people are more excited about in this room. Beaver restoration opportunities. And in this context, beaver restoration refers, it includes strategically targeting stream restoration to entice colonization of beavers, as well as beaver translocation. But we really want to emphasize this stream restoration to entice natural colonization. And just an example of what that looks like, here's a series of photographs, drone photos from Mark Beardsley at Ecometrics. This is Rough and Tumbling Creek in South Park. This creek had lots of evidence of historic beaver activity, but beaver had not been there for many years. The channel had become somewhat incised and disconnected from the floodplain. There were beavers in the watershed, however, they just hadn't been colonizing the site. So Mark and his team came in and they installed a bunch of BDAs, and you can kind of see them and how it's increased the surface area of the water in the creek. This is what they look like. And that was cool. It had the desired effect of connecting the floodplain a little bit, but really nothing in comparison to what happened when the beavers then moved in. And it turned out all they needed was just kind of the basic requirements to colonize the area. Beavers need deep water. That's their source of cover. They need good, abundant, deciduous vegetation. That's their source of food and building materials. So if your streams aren't restored first and don't have those things, you're not going to have beavers recolonize naturally. You're not doing them any favors if you're releasing them there. So we used the Colorado Beaver Activity Mapper, which I alluded to before. This is a great tool that CNHP with several partners developed, and it's basically a spatial machine learning imagery recognition model that uses naked imagery that's flown on odd years and analyzes it and identifies where there's beaver ponds on the landscape. So we use that in combination, and so this is just kind of an example. Well, this is the output statewide for all beaver activity from, I think, 2011 to 2021. And then on the left, CNHP has also been working on this model for potential beaver habitat. And here's an example of that model output in the Rolling Fork headwaters. We see these yellow lines are the computer models, what it's projecting as potential beaver habitat. And that model is being driven largely by the valley slope and the proximity to historic wetlands from the 1983 National Wetland Inventory data. And so you can see kind of how that overlays the blue polygons with the orange polygons in this specific example, where there's lots of potential beaver habitat, but no active beaver habitat. And so we want to use this kind of data, and we are using this kind of data to identify the greatest opportunities for restoration by considering that ratio of where is there lots of unoccupied potential habitat, but no beavers occupying the habitat, and then bring in additional factors like land use, infrastructure, other sources of human beaver conflict. And so we're, our goal for this chapter is to support a thriving beaver population in Colorado by identifying opportunities and encouraging strategic restoration of ecologically and socially suitable historic, but currently unoccupied beaver habitats. There's 4 strategies to support this goal. Actually 3, I'm sorry. The first is to identify the greatest opportunities for beaver restoration. And again, this is going to be a mapping exercise using that overlay of suitable habitat and occupied habitat. And then we want to use that to identify a subset of watersheds, which we're calling ROWs, or Beaver Restoration Opportunity Watersheds. These are those watersheds that have the greatest potential for ecological lift from beaver restoration. And we can bring in other information to minimize human conflict. We want to increase the occupation of unoccupied suitable habitat as our second strategy. We want to coordinate with partners to prioritize and implement restoration activities in watersheds with abundant acreage of suitable unoccupied habitat. And then, where appropriate, pair translocation, so relocation of beavers with vetted restoration sites. And then the third strategy is to create and maintain beaver-focused tools and resources. There's 2 I'll highlight here. The first is to develop and maintain a beaver decision support system to screen restoration opportunity watersheds and sites. We actually we have a contract with CHP with a deliverable of June 30th for this tool. So this will be a public-facing tool where anybody who's interested in beaver restoration can bring in these different mapping layers of where there's suitable habitat based on the model, where there currently are beavers, the watersheds where we think beaver restoration should occur, and then start bringing other information like distribution of other species that may be dependent. And we want to connect people seeking to restore habitat to tools and resources through outreach and engagement. And that's part of what I'm doing here today. All right, so chapter 6 is living with beaver, non-lethal solutions to conflict resolution. And we are 3 out of 5 chapters done, so we're getting there, guys. I know, I see some sleepy faces out there. If anyone needs to stand up and do some jumping jacks, I get it. A lot of talking, a lot of words on slides. Anyways, here we are, chapter 6. Beavers are frequently involved in human-beaver conflicts at the interface of aquatic systems and human infrastructure. This includes things like flooding of roads, plugging up the ditches and headgates for irrigation, flooding of property, and all as a result of a beaver's propensity to build dams wherever they see flowing water. And these human beaver conflicts are a significant source of beaver mortality, as I touched on there in chapter 4. A lot of these conflicts result in lethal removal of beavers, oftentimes because they need to be dealt with quickly. But living with beaver approaches or coexistence have really improved substantially in the past decade and are an emphasis of the beaver strategy. As I alluded to, conflict management of beavers is not under CPW's jurisdiction. So we really approach this as let's make more tools available and resources to support people, organizations, towns that are having regular beaver conflicts. And there is a recent article in the Wright that I thought I'd shed some light on. It was just published a week and a half or 2 weeks ago about Denver Parks and Recreation. They have a really progressive beaver coexistence program. They were part of our stakeholder group, and so got to learn about it through them in that context as well. But this is a really great article. They are not killing that many beavers in Denver, despite having a lot of beaver conflicts. And you can imagine in the urban setting of Denver, that's quite a challenge. But they've managed to partner with Wildlife Services, who concurrently has been building up their beaver coexistence program and are using a lot of these tools. So I forgot to mention that. So two of the key tools that are available include things like this one here called a pond leveler, which basically sets the elevation, surface water elevation of a pond at a level that's acceptable for the human, but allows the beaver to have what it needs as well. And then these keystone fences or culvert screens are another one. And Denver's been using these things for the past few years increasingly, and really trying to ramp up their coexistence programs. So just a really picture of what they're doing there. Another thing, the common concern that people have is beavers cut down trees. That's what they do. And people sometimes don't like it when beavers take out really mature cottonwood trees that provide shade for and habitat for the wildlife. Now, I will mention that beavers coppicing wetlands, deciduous trees like cottonwoods actually helps their regeneration in the long run, so it's all part of the cycle. But we're humans and we like what we like. We like the big trees. So protecting trees, this is an area of coexistence where there's also some great guidelines on how to fence the tree, to keep beavers from chewing it down. Also, sanded paint is something that's people like because you can blend the paint color with the tree and people don't even know it's there, but the beaver can't chew it down. So there's recipes for that that are available as well. And so I think for kind of the context of this chapter, a lot of the input we received from our stakeholder engagement really steered this chapter. There was a great desire and emphasis on coexistence from a lot of our stakeholders. However, we did hear from a lot of our private landowners that they felt they should continue to have the right and ability to legally manage beavers as needed. And then also this acknowledgement that beavers aren't a fit everywhere. Sometimes beavers colonize areas that just aren't good for them. They're not going to be good for them in the long run, and they're creating a conflict with the humans that are there. So that has to be considered. We heard a lot that financial assistance and incentives need to be available to landowners if we want them to voluntarily take up coexistence strategies. And cost share program is one thing that was regularly mentioned. Technical assistance should be available to support landowners. And then one thing that we learned a lot about from our technical working group is just how important training is for effective installation of coexistence. And this training, in turn, leads to greater acceptance of their use, because when they're improperly installed, they can create problems or just create, a misunderstanding that maybe these things don't work. Maintenance of coexistence devices is important, but some of our trained coexistence installers told us that a properly installed device, we're having to spend 1 or 2 hours a year for maintenance. So it needs to be accounted for, but it's also not that big of a deal. And then maintenance, again, is important for their continued utility and acceptance. And then both the messaging and the messenger are important for developing education and outreach for coexistence, and who that messenger is and what that messaging is might vary geographically depending on sort of the socio-political context. And then this is just a topic where it's ripe for collaboration with partners and a lot of people interested in doing this kind of work. So we're really excited about the future of coexistence with beavers. And so the goal of this chapter is to promote the widespread adoption of non-lethal solutions to common beaver conflicts when such solutions are appropriate and feasible. And there's 4 strategies to support this goal. The first is to increase education about the value of beaver and available non-lethal solutions. And one action I want to highlight here is to lead and collaborate with partners on developing external co-branded education materials. And the second strategy is to collaborate with partners on comprehensive outreach that reaches diverse key audiences. One action I want to highlight here is identify these key people to create and distribute Living with Beaver educational materials that reach key audiences. The third strategy is to expand statewide capacity of CPW and our partners for coexistence through formal training and by supporting volunteer networks. We really want to develop a network of trained coexistence contacts for every geographic region. So there's always someone reachable to assist that's got the formal training within an hour. All right. So moving on to Chapter 7, translocation policy and protocol. Translocation in this context is just a human-assisted movement of individuals beyond their home range. And it's a potential outcome in a stepwise conflict resolution process, but it should be the last resort prior to lethal removal, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute. So it should be used carefully and strategically to support restoration objectives. And the reason why I say carefully is for two reasons. One, the survival and success of beaver translocation is very variable. There are studies that show survival or success of relocated beavers anywhere from 20% to 60%. And on that 60% end, that's where people have gone in and done a lot of preparation to receive the beavers where they're being released. But there's also a lot of concern about the unintended spread of aquatic nuisance species and aquatic pathogens that can harm the wildlife. There's a lot of research going on right now about the ability of BD or chytrid fungus, which afflicts our state endangered boreal toads, and its ability to persist on beaver pelts. It turns out it does quite well on them. So these are just concerns we have to think about when contemplating doing beaver translocations. And beaver translocation, as I covered in the very beginning of this talk, has always been a relevant management tool in Colorado. We permit private parties and public individuals to translocate beavers, and those translocation permits are really just based on the release site and making sure the release site is a good place for beavers to go. But there's been a lot of work, especially in the Pacific Northwest, on beaver translocation, and there's been just great insights from some of these more coordinated programs, like the Yakima Beaver Project and the Mahal Beaver Project up in Washington. And there's increased interest from a lot of our partners in more coordinated efforts, so that when a beaver needs to be moved, there's already a place identified where it can be released. So there's this kind of expressed desire for more standardized and efficient permitting. We heard a lot about how inconsistent our permitting process is, depending on where you are in the state. So we just want to make that a little more standardized. And then, as I alluded to before, there's just concerns around disease spread. I talked about chytrid fungus. We're also really concerned about whirling disease that affects our trout. And a lot of these beaver releases will be occurring where we have our native cutthroat trout, and we'll make sure we're not spreading whirling disease too. And so that really creates this need for holding facilities where you can quarantine the beavers for a few days, give them fresh water to hopefully rinse some of these pathogens off of them. So the goal for this chapter is to optimize translocation as a tool to support restoration objectives by providing a standard permitting process that maximizes translocation success while reducing the risk of disease and aquatic nuisance species spread. And there's two strategies, to support this goal. The first is to develop a standardized and understandable translocation permitting process. We want to utilize a special licensing shop to help standardize this while still having the same chain of command approval, but possibly including additional staff such as our aquatic biologists to make sure beaver release permitted sites are places we want beavers from aquatic management priority perspective. The second strategy is to develop translocation procedures that maximize beaver well-being and translocation success. Part of this is building a network of those beaver holding facilities. We have 2 CPW properties currently that can assist in this capacity. Our Wildlife Health Lab in Fort Collins has a facility that they used to use for mountain lion research. We're actually in the process of converting now for beaver holding. Our Frisco Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, the only one of its kind that we have in the San Luis Valley, has been providing beaver holding facilities for a project down there, the Rio Grande Water Restoration Project. But that's just 2 regions. It would be nice to have at least one of these in each of those regions. And then we want to continue to research pathogen persistence on beaver, and then have a better understanding of the spatial distribution of these aquatic pathogens so we can make more informed decisions about risk. And here's just a few examples of some of the holding facilities that people have developed for beaver translocation around the West. I'm not showing the new state-of-the-art one in Cody, Wyoming. That's been called the Beaver Hotel. It's really cool, but just by way of example. So I want to wrap it up. We have this in the intro of the Beaver strategy. We have this bulletin list of what we call visions for success. I just want to end by reading those to you and then talk about how we have a new program that hopefully is going to help us realize those visions for success. So our visions for success are that Colorado has a thriving beaver population and historical beaver wetland habitat is recovered. Beaver have been restored in many formerly occupied watersheds that contain adequate habitat. Watershed health has improved, increasing resilience to droughts, floods, and wildfire, and wetland habitat condition and biodiversity has increased. Stream wetland corridor restoration efforts are targeted strategically to maximize successful recolonization by beaver and minimize conflicts with human infrastructure. Land and water managers in the public have a greater understanding of the value of beaver and a greater desire for coexisting with them. Translocation of beaver is conducted selectively to minimize risk of pathogen transmission while maximizing successful reestablishment. Abundant beaver and sustainable management strategies support avocational harvest without compromising restoration efforts. Networks of trained practitioners exist in all major watersheds to restore beaver in their habitat and to provide rapid response to land and water managers experiencing beaver conflicts to assist with non-lethal solutions when feasible. State, federal, county, and municipal governments are working together in supporting nonprofits and diverse stakeholders and communities to promote living with beaver and the wetlands they create. And then public and private land and water managers are engaged as key partners in beaver and wetland restoration. And just about a week ago, our governor issued a press release about some new funding that's coming out with multiple priorities, including this beaver strategy. In 2024, the legislature passed Senate Bill 230, which is a fee on oil and gas development. That is supposed to go directly to climate-related and biodiversity-related priorities. And so the Beaver strategy was a really natural fit for this new source of funding. We've got the governor just announced $1.1 million in annual funding to support the Beaver strategy, which is going to start with the hiring of a Beaver conservation coordinator. It's going to include development of some of these holding facilities initially, and some research around that. A large chunk of it is going to be infused to our wetland restoration efforts to specifically target beaver-related restoration. A good bit of it is going to go towards population monitoring and harvest. We want to update, to continuously update and refine the beaver mapping and the development of systems for this new mandatory check. Although the commission hasn't officially voted on it, they will in July. They seem very supportive. So we're already developing these processes and apps now so that our CSRs are able to do these mandatory checks on beavers. And then a significant amount of funding going into conflict resolution to develop a landowner cost share program and develop the distribution of information, education materials, and some internal capacity building for staff to get trained. And with that, I would just like to say thank you on behalf of the team of staff at CPW and our team of contractors that were really incredible to work with to develop this Beaver strategy. We didn't know what we were getting into when we started it. At one point, felt like, oh, we're just making this thing and it's going to get shelved. And no one's going to care about it anymore. But to get the news that a new program is going to be funded was really excited, and I'm just really grateful to have been part of that and to have gotten to work with so many great people through our stakeholder engagement that care about this topic, even those that maybe deal with a lot of Beaver. So, and thank you all for listening and letting me be here tonight to talk to you about our Beaver strategy.
We'll entertain some questions from the audience.
Please.
Okay, so don't stump a chump. That's an easy question. Here we go.
I went to the Beaver County Farmers Alliance, and I'm really interested to know your stakeholding process. Did you encounter farmers, ranchers, producers who were really advocating for beaver coexistence?
I would not go as far as to use the word advocating, but we heard the folks that we had on our stakeholder focus group express value and interest. Advocating, I wouldn't go that far, but I think they were interested, and it's what I learned too. You hear a lot about the beaver haters out there, and sure, I think there's probably a lot of that out there, but I think beaver landowners' relationship with beaver is maybe different than it is with something like wolves. And that they've been living with beavers for generations and working around them on their lands for the most part. And some have different ways of dealing with it. Some they just always defaulted to killing right away. Others understand that a beaver wetland means free sub-irrigation of their hayden. So, it's a wide range of interests and understanding. Yes.
You mentioned that there was a potential unnaturalist community project. I was just wondering if, maybe that's I'm sure it's still in development, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that might look like and how somebody might get involved.
Yeah, well, I would love to hear some ideas, quite honestly. So we are actually, what's that?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question was about the iNatural Citizen Science Project and what that'll look like, what it'll include, and how to get involved. I think we haven't really fleshed that out yet, but I think when we hire the Beaver coordinators, we're actually working, the governor asked for us to develop a list of goals for early implementation. And we've done that. One of the high priority ones is the citizen science projects. I think that's just something we need to get off the ground right away. But I think the idea would be that there'd be certain criteria that you're looking for when you're logging using this specific project. And that it would be available to anyone, but it would be promoted to, watershed groups, coalitions, and such, like, hey, use this tool if you would to log your beaver observations. So it's all being done in a standardized way and going to the same database.
Seems like those beaver conflict people would also be the Beaver Institute folks would be another one to involve in that as well.
Yeah, the Beaver Institute folks would be good. And part of the reason I'm wanting to do that is to help validate some of the COBAM output on beaver activity, to start developing some metrics around, okay, well, what are the proportion of model sites that are actually currently active? Yes. Oh, there were some other hands before, but now there's.
Okay, so I think the new Beaver program is funded, or you said it's funded by Orlando.
Mm-hmm.
So will there be an opportunity for that to increase, or will it stay at that?
So the 1.1 million is not enough?
That's what that guy was asking for. That's
No, it's a good point. Yes, and I'll just, in full transparency, when we were asked, we didn't ever think we were going to be putting together a budget to support the strategy. And when we were asked to, we needed to have, and yeah, this is the way it works. And so we came up with kind of a range where that amount was the base. And then we identified opportunities for growth. We felt like there are a lot of priorities that are competing for that SB 230 funding. And this is the initial round of it. There's projections of lots of millions of dollars, but it's also a volatile source. So all these were kind of factors that were being considered. And it was really hard to get approval for a permanent full-time employee position as part of it because it is a volatile funding source. But felt good that we were able to get that. But no, I think there will be opportunities for growth. I think the first step is to get a staff member in as a Beaver coordinator to start doing this work and identifying what those additional resource needs. I think it would have been fiscally irresponsible to just throw out a number like $3 million without having a strategy, a real implementation plan to support it. Yes, Larry.
Has Colorado's complex water rights water law system become involved in discussion on the Beaver management?
I said only easy questions. Yeah, so we coordinated and met with DWR multiple times. As I don't know if people know this, but there's another Senate Bill 270, SB 270, which is the stream restoration bill that was intended to provide clarity on what requires consultation with DWR from a water rights standpoint and what doesn't. And a lot of it was focused initially on low-tech process-based restoration of beaver mimicry. And, we talk about SB 270 in one paragraph in the strategy, simply to say that there are guidelines for what constitutes legal beaver restoration. Anything beyond that, you consult your local district engineer. So that's the extent of it. I think there's a lot of gray area when you start talking about the actual restoration of beavers, and there's a lot of gray language in DWR's statute on such matters, and it's probably going to take legal processes, someone suing or something, to provide clarity on what is allowed and what isn't. But I don't know if that answers your question, Larry.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Colorado Water Plan, portions of that speak very passionately to riparian restoration and managing beavers is the primary method of doing that. And so I think that they could be done as well.
Yeah. And nonetheless, when a senior water right holder is not getting their water and there's becomes a beaver dam that's been built upstream of their head gate, that's where there's potential conflict and a need for resolution and clarity. Over here.
You said that the success rate for the translocation of beavers is between 20 and 60%.
Yeah.
Why is it so?
Well, so that's just drawing from kind of the range of available literature, that 20%, and don't quote me on the exact number, it's in the ballpark, say plus or minus 5, was from a study just north of the border in Wyoming. And they moved like over 100 beavers. They didn't do any site prep. They didn't give consideration to moving whole family units. That's another thing I forgot to mention. So one of the reasons to have holding facilities is that beaver relocations has a much higher success rate when you can move the whole family, because that's how they do things.
Dam building's a family business?
What's that?
Dam building's a family business.
Dam building is a family business. The average colony size that we use for our population is 5.5. If you look in the literature, It ranges anywhere from 4 to like 8 or 9, but it seems most of the beaver colonies that I'm familiar with in Colorado are in 5. It's usually a male and female adults, a couple of yearlings, and then a couple of young, 2 or 3 young a year on average. And then they kick them out when they turn 2. Go figure it out. Yes.
First, huge congratulations on getting to this point, because I know this Beaver dialogue has been trying to get going now for quite a few years, and I think you guys really pulled the process together and have created an amazing result. I'm curious what CPW's role is going from here in terms of working with organizations like the sponsors of this program tonight, in terms of helping move restoration forward, say, in northern Colorado. What's CPW's role beyond encouragement?
Good question. So what is CPW's role beyond encouragement, and how do you work with partners like the ones sponsoring this event tonight? That's exactly, I think, where the rubber meets the road on this topic. And I think this strategy is only going to be as good as the stakeholder engagement and its implementation. And I don't think the stakeholder engagement should stop the release of the strategy. So certainly the Beaver program, when it launches here with the new staff member, is going to be a staff of 1 with a pretty sizable budget. So I think CPW's role will be to be that sort of coordinating force to help all the sort of disparate entities kind of work towards a common goal, and then also a source of funding, potentially for restoration and coexistence. So I think that, I don't know if that completely answers your question, but we really see this strategy being most effective if implemented at the watershed scale. And we've had great examples, like the partners in the room tonight, like the Yampa Valley Beaver Working Group, like the Rio Grande Headwaters Restoration Project, to kind of give us an example of how this can work at the local watershed scale. I think that's where it's going to be most successful.
You guys aren't involved in the permitting process at all, except for translocation. Is that correct?
Yes, we are not directly involved in the permitting process for habitat restoration. Or coexistence. And we are the key party involved in permitting beaver relocation. Yes.
Hi. I think these are kind of 2 different issues, but I think you did mention the name of that animal at the beginning of the building. What have you learned from that kind of beaver reduction effort that would that you might utilize if you needed this human animal conflict? Like, what are some of the lessons that you've learned from that this project in terms of going forward with this project?
That's probably a question that goes beyond my pay grade. But so what have we learned from the wolf restoration and human-wildlife conflict? But I will just say just a few observations, and this goes back to the question about funding. I think starting small. I think with the wolf restoration program, it was a lot foisted on our agency at once, a big budget, a lot of staff, and get this thing done, do it fast. And I think kind of pumping the brakes, starting, and we're already off to a good start. Let's write the strategy first. And then let's think about and go through prioritize implementation of how you do it.
But before that, you work to develop the strategy, and then you release the strategy.
Right.
You get the strategy first, but there's some stuff that went into it. It wasn't, you have to get this done because the voters took the program.
Right, yeah, so there's that. And then I think a lot of our internal processes, like we just didn't have as much time as we should have had to iron out what our processes for how we communicate internally on conflict. So I think we have an opportunity to do that here to kind of really formalize or make more official what is our process when there's a beaver conflict? What is our process when there's a beaver translocation proposal? I think that'll be, those are some of those process-based things or some of those early goals that we committed to with the governor's office as well. So I think we have an opportunity here to do it right. I think not that we didn't do it right with wolves, we did the best we could with the time we had.
It seems like there's more opportunity for positive community engagement, you know, like things around, public, that makes me excited to
Right.
really provides opportunity to really the industry that come on.
Yes, I agree with that. And I think you said it really well. You go anywhere, I could go in Greeley somewhere, I'm sure you ride the Critter Trail, you'll find somewhere where there's beaver impacted wetlands, and I think there's a great opportunity to have that information and education component where there already are beavers. I think we have a great opportunity on our state parks to where we deal with beaver conflicts, and we'll be promoting coexistence to have information and education built around that. Cherry Creek State Park and Chapel State Park deal with a lot of beaver conflicts, and they're some of our most visited state parks. So I think there's a real opportunity there as well. Yeah, I'll go here and then
Karen in the back, that way.
I knew it. I'm sorry, dude.
So, I'd like to say I understood, I've been trying to digest it. You mentioned the single species management and then, the decision support system.
Yeah.
To what extent does the cost coming back on other species weigh in the decision making for restoration projects? And does that kind of reflect the priority of the state? Because from a fiscal perspective, you might want to look at the most diverse impact on multiple species, versus the other competing interests they discussed. So that's one still trying to digest that.
Yeah. So we have talked about core factors and secondary factors for the decision support tool. And the core factors are those, suitable beaver habitat that's unoccupied, current beaver activity, likelihood for human beaver conflicts, and all those things. Secondary to that, we've talked about bringing in layers of data, like distribution data on some of our swap species or species of greatest conservation need in our state wildlife action plan. But those can be really nuanced. There's some situations with those where you might really want beavers, like for boreal toads. There's some situations where we want beavers because it's going to create good breeding habitat for boreal toads. But there's some situations where we don't want to relocate beavers there because we have boreal toads there and we don't want to increase the chance of them getting fungus, which wipes out the breeding site within a year. So it's kind of nuanced, and so we've kind of wrangled with how to incorporate those kind of data. I think the best thing is to have those core factors, and then on this public-facing tool, we'll be able to bring in those layers and say, if you're interested in doing beaver restoration in an area that's identified as an opportunity area, that you can then bring in other species distribution data, and then you at least know who to contact. How is this going to affect that species? Does that make sense?
Yeah, the primary priority of viability and layers is still nuanced, but case by case.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. All right.
I have an easy question and a hard question. So I'll start with the easy one. As a practitioner and somebody, the first question people ask always is when are you going to return beaver to the site that you're restoring? I appreciate that you guys are addressing that. I'm wondering what you anticipate the timeline being for translocation or guidance, like a facility where there's a holding facility or guidance on the best practices, what the time frame for that is.
Yeah, I think right now, status quo. So if you want to move beavers, until we have sort of this coordination piece in place, you talk to your local district wildlife manager and start the process of getting your release site permitted. And then the other hard part about and why I think this would benefit from greater coordination is then you need to find a source of beavers and get them moved. There's no quarantine requirements now, but there likely will be. once we have the systems in place. I think the ideal scenario, like once this program is up and running, is that there's holding facilities in every region. There's people that can do trapping, so that can be wildlife services. In some cases, that could be CPW. It could be private nuisance wildlife operators. And there's holding facilities. And then there's approved release sites. And I'd really like to encourage like any watershed coalition or any organized group to strategically identify all the places in one fell swoop that they would like to translocate beavers to and get those permitted all together. And I think ideally that permit lasts. Maybe it needs to get renewed. And I think these are the details we'll have to work through on an annual basis. But that way we have this log of potential vetted, permitted release sites so that when a conflict happens over here, I pick up the phone and I say, hey, Taryn, you got these approved release sites. We've got beavers. We've got a holding facility they can go to tomorrow. I think that's where the coordination comes in, but I think that speaks to like, we got to slow down and build these processes and the infrastructure first.
Sorry, my follow-up for the question, thank you for that, is, also as a practitioner, someone who's looking for funding constantly, we have great mechanisms in Colorado. I've learned through the years that we are an amazing state for prioritizing stream health and restoration. But kind of with this strategy, you're introducing these additional values that are specific to CPW and might not align directly with like Colorado Water Conservation Board or the water plan. I mean, there is a lot of overlap. But is there conversation about coordinating those funding sources when it comes to, like, the Wetlands for Wildlife is, not the most expensive funding source, although really valuable in the sphere. But if it's more like specifically toward beaver, is there going to be a value added to like CWCB's funding or some like the restore grant or any of these different funding mechanisms that they can coordinate values for people that are trying to achieve these like overlapping goals? Or I guess do you have thoughts on like?
Yeah, and we had CWCB staff on our technical team, and you specifically mentioned CWCB, so I'll talk about them. And yes, they have there's a lot of overlap with some of their programs, especially around the Colorado's water plan and stream management planning grants. We put a recommended action under one of the strategies to have our funding better coordinated with CWCB, and I don't know exactly what that looks like now, but certainly open to ideas. I could foresee it being like if you're applying for a water plan grant and your proposal checks a box for our Beaver strategy, that just adds strength to your proposal and potential funding and vice versa. If you're applying to our funding and it's part of a water plan grant or CWCB, that would increase its priority. That's the only way I've thought of how to do it, but if you have ideas or thoughts, or if anyone does, it'd be interesting. Yeah.
So for part of it, from the Beaver Institute, there is grant funding for landowners to do what's called the site evaluation, where they come and get the context for wherever that conflict is, and for the device implementation, whether it's a pond leveler, culvert protected fencing. And the grants can be up to 1/3 of those two costs. So you're talking at least $500, maybe $1,000. These things don't tend to be crazy expensive. But I talked with Beaver Institute, and they found 1/3 to be kind of the magic number, because you need enough that the landowner actually has a stake in ensuring the continued viability of whatever that solution is. But it also takes the sting out of it and makes it maybe twice as expensive as trapping and relocation. So it does make it more viable. And I asked, well, how long does this grant program last throughout the year? And they said, well, sometimes we run out of money because it's an annual funding source. They'll run out midsummer. Other times they're asking for people to apply in the fall. So it's real important to just work with a Beaver Institute certified wetland specialists because they will give them the documentation that the landowner needs to then go ahead and at least help with the bill. So again, that might be something for folks to consider as they're looking at that. And it's certainly like, it's free money, why wouldn't you try? I asked if there's any restrictions at whether it's private landowners or government. They said no, which was a little surprising to me, but it is what it is.
Do you know any certified beaver professionals?
I do, actually. but there's others in the area as well. Nope, you got one more.
Do you happen to know of any restoration projects going on in Beaver area in outside North County?
I think I could wing it and talk about a few, but there's probably other people in this room that can answer that question better, like Karen back here.
Do you want to say anything, Karen? The question was restoration projects in Weld County and Red Feather. Is that a good summary?
Okay, so many. So Elbrook Creek is kind of CPRW's baby for a really long time. We've recently partnered with Land Conservation District as well on other projects. In fact, we announced that we're going to have 6 miles of restoration tree which was completed on that top 10 watershed alone. So that's Red Feather Lakes area. We also are thinking about moving outside. So that's a burn scar, it's burn adjacent. We're also looking at moving outside of the burn scar in areas like the CPW Cherokee Park area. We have a few projects that we're looking at if that is a new territory in terms of not working in a post-fire environment and also entering into an environment that has a lot more aridity and conflicts like grazing and ranching, which we can get into.
And then Nate has quite a few projects in the Livermore area as well.
Yeah, we've been working in the Livermore area. We did our first BDA installations in 2015 on the Roberts Ranch in the Campbell Valley. That project is nearing its completion, and we're hoping to introduce Beaver to the site in the next year or two.
Sure, yes. Another project that is in the works that partnered with Ryan and CRV, Wetlands for Wildlife proposal, is beaver restoration in George Creek, which is in the North Fork of the Beaver watershed, and is a location where we've been working for a decade now on a greenback aquifer trout restoration project. We're really hopeful that's going to get funded through our wetlands program. We also got funding from the Western Native Trout Initiative. We submitted an application to biophilia, so hopefully we'll get that one going.
Yeah, so real important to look at the WRB and Rocky Mountain Flycasters Trout Unlimited volunteer opportunities because there could be some close to home coming up here soon.
Yes.
When you started these holding facilities, can you like, that's the kind of work where you like, watch that sort of on them, educate something that really the chance of spreading these wilder quarantine or nothing for that possible?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question was, when you've got beavers in the holding facility, is there anything you can do to mitigate the fact that they might have pathogens on their pelts or their hide? And so, yeah, yes-ish. So it's one area of active research that we're supporting funding. We were supporting funding even before the Beaver strategy on what are some different practices. We've tested drying, saline rinses. There's things we haven't tested yet. So the standard practice for a lot of beaver quarantine facilities is to hold them for a minimum of 72 hours and then have 2 8-hour dry periods where they don't have access to water. no one has really tested the efficacy of that. The research that we have supported so far, drying is not 100% effective at removing the fungus that causes chytrid fungus, but does reduce it greatly. So it's an area of active research. Yes.
Since you're talking about diseases, it was on a slide, but can you mention tularemia and any info or concerns about that in the beavers?
Yeah, so tularemia is a zoonotic disease, meaning it can spread not just between beavers, but to other wildlife and to humans. It's definitely out and about on the landscape. We'll have beaver mortality events where we submit samples to our wildlife health lab and they test positive for tularemia. When beavers get tularemia, they're dead in pretty short order. It doesn't take long for it to have the effect on them. There's anecdotal evidence that there was a big beaver die-off in the 1990s in Colorado. We hear a lot of our older game wardens talk about that. Larry, you know anything about that?
Couldn't tell you.
Yeah, so we know it's out there. We don't know what role it's playing in regulating beaver populations. And so that's an area of research that we're recommending as part of the beaver strategy. I think it's what you saw in terms of like concern about moving to tularemia through translocated beavers. It would be very unlikely, especially using holding facilities that they would survive. You would know they'd be clinically ill upon arrival.
You mentioned that your facility where you guys have your like pig caps and everything for research is how long do you think you'll have like the beaver research happening before you start implementing the quarantine protocol?
So the question was, how long will we be doing this beaver holding research before we implement a quarantine protocol? And so that's part of what we want to do in this first year is use the wildlife health lab facility. So they've got a facility that they used to use for researching chronic wasting disease in mountain lions. So does that persist in a mountain lion that consumes a deer that's affected with chronic wasting disease? They haven't been doing that research there for like 5 or 6 years, so this space is open. It's actually pretty ideal for how we can use it. And in this first year, we'd like to move some beavers through the facility and test out and kind of pilot some care intake procedures. And then at the end of the season, develop, based on our experiences on the available literature, quarantine guidelines and protocols that our other facilities can use. And then there's other partner facilities that come online and they meet our requirements or criteria, and that can be a possibility as well.
It can be added to the list. Yeah.
Yeah, added to the list. This new beaver coordinators can do this. Corey dreamed up a lot of work. Yes.
Thank you. I just want to say I was just wondering, what was I'm looking for the rationale behind unlimited harvest numbers for beavers because for bears, and have you seen any evidence of important beaver years
Yeah, so the question was, what's the rationale behind unlimited harvest of beavers? We used to not have unlimited harvest of beavers. Prior to 1996 and the passage of Amendment 14, we didn't have drainage-wide caps like we're proposing in the strategy. But as that graph that I showed illustrated, after that trapping restriction went into effect, beaver harvest went really low. And for many years, the state was intentionally managing beaver with a quota of around 10,000 beavers. So that acknowledges that there's some level of take that is sustainable because we were doing it. But also, there's lots of literature on this topic across the West on what is a sustainable rate of harvest to maintain a stable population of beavers. So that combined with The actual participation in beaver hunting and trapping and harvest rates are why we've maintained that unlimited bag limit on beavers through all these years, because we've never come close to reaching a level of harvest that would be problematic, at least at a statewide level. Does that answer your question? Okay.
There's a worry that it will exceed more, or is the graph like on that more trajectory?
Is there a worry that it would exceed more? Not from our scientists that do this, that follow this closely. No, there's not a concern. I think where there is a concern, as we think in the context of beaver restoration, certainly it would be counterproductive to be harvesting beaver potentially in a watershed where you're trying to restore them, and trying to get them from zero up to some higher level. So I think that's one of the reasons why we want to have a better understanding of the spatial, so where beavers are being harvested, how many and which watersheds, because right now we only have that information at the resolution statewide. Yes.
And just speaking of numbers, and obviously the numbers of beavers not an issue. So the original reason for them maybe abandoning some of the waterways is that due to environmental drought conditions or other factors, or what would you say is the original cause of maybe not proliferating areas where we want to see them?
Yeah, I think in most cases, I think there's this real sort of paradox or dichotomy where beavers are doing really well in a lot of places where maybe we don't want them as badly because they create conflicts, but not doing as well in some of our headwater watersheds where we want the fire resilience, the drought resilience they provide. So kind of a weird paradox to be working in. Yeah, so your question was, what is the limiting factor essentially?
Yeah, what is, what's creating the conditions that require some introduction to be done in areas?
Yes.
Suitable waterways, is that part of it?
Well, to kind of reiterate what I said in the presentation, we really want to sort of emphasize habitat restoration and encourage natural colonization, so target restoration where there's beavers nearby that will naturally colonize over reintroduction. And in some places, there may not be current pathways or beavers in close enough proximity to recolonize on their own, and that's where translocation should be the go-to tool. I think probably the biggest limiting factor and why beavers aren't proliferating to the degree that some might like in our headwaters is all comes down to habitat. In many of our watersheds, there's a legacy of overgrazing that even if grazing practices have changed, the stream is kind of beyond the point of return in terms of being suitable for a beaver to colonize. Because again, they need that deep water. It's their cover. Otherwise, they're just like what did Niall say, a waddling hamburger or waddling cheeseburger on legs, which I think he took from Eager, because I remember reading that in Eager. So they need the deep water. They need the abundant riparian vegetation.
So if you've had overgrazing and there's no willows for them to eat, then there's also not much for them to make a dam out of either, even if they have the desire, but maybe deep water in that particular spot. So why are you going to help out on the WRV project?
I was in one, I think it was with Nate and Melkor maybe last year. I don't know what I was doing, but I'm trying to move some stuff around.
Well, we do have tables in the back that have some brochures from the different groups. Again, I'd like to give a big thank you to